Good morning, everyone. This is Adam Johnson, and you are listening to For the Love of Truth, a weekly radio broadcast committed to the pursuit of absolute truth as defined by God, who is himself the author of all truth. For the Love of Truth is a ministry of Veritas Reformed Baptist Church in West Monroe, Louisiana. Well, once again this week, we're very fortunate to have back with us Rusty Grant. Rusty is the pastor of Grace Covenant Baptist in Monroe. So, Rusty, welcome back to the studio again.
Well, thanks for having me, Adam.
This week, I'd like to kind of pick up our conversation that we left off with last week regarding confessionalism and the importance of churches having a confession of faith that ties us to the Scripture and roots our interpretation of Scripture in the historic orthodoxy of the church. This week, I'd like to kind of expand that concept to talk a little bit about Baptist confessionalism. In other words, the history of confessions of faith in over the course of the development of the Baptist denomination. We have a number of those, I think, that are very important. All the way back in 1611, we have the Helwys Confession of Faith, Thomas Helwys, and he was greatly influenced by Mennonites and by their traditions. And that confession has, from my perspective, a lot of holes in it and a lot of problems, but we can point to that and see some early tendencies like the separation of church and state, even predating that as a concept in our cultural context. Even in England, this idea that Helwys had of separating church and state and not allowing those authorities to clash with one another or mix with one another is apparent in Baptist history. Other confessions of faith that have arisen, for example, the First and Second London Baptist Confessions of Faith, those came out of our early Baptist forefathers and have given us a great foundation. So I know that Grace Covenant holds to the 1689 Confession of Faith, just like we do. So what can you offer us this morning as we start to consider just the importance of confessionalism for Baptists?
Well, I think it's an interesting thought that so many times gets missed kind of in everyday church life. We have the Protestant Reformation in around 1517, 1520, with Martin Luther nailing the 95 Thesis on the door at Wittenberg. And, within about 100 years of that, we begin to see the historic confessions begin to come onto the scene. You mentioned the Helwys in 1611. You have the True Confession in 1596, which was another separatist confession. And that one really had a lot of influence on the First London. You also see the 39 Articles in 1563, which was formative in the Church of England. The 39 Articles are still used today. In that context, the Irish Articles of 1615, Cambridge Platform of 1648. And so you've got these confessions beginning to be formulated and put together for a variety of different reasons, but the end goal for each one of them was to clearly state what the group of people that was putting that confession together, what they believed.
Right. And I think just for our listeners to kind of keep everybody on the same page here, Rusty, it might be important for us to note that Baptist history takes us back through primarily the Church of England.
Yes.
The separatists that came out of the Church of England, because the Reformation in England was much messier and much more up and down and politically volatile than the Reformation in other places. The Reformation is always politically volatile, but within the Church of England, you seem to have this attempt to straddle the fence, this attempt to hold on to certain elements of the old Roman Catholic system and to sort of bring that into this new, at the time, new understanding of faith of the Protestant Reformation. And the separatists, our forefathers as Baptists, would have looked at that and said, wait a minute, this is just not cutting it. This is not a true Reformation. So the separatists were in favor of going to that logical next step. And these confessions that we're talking about, every one of them you mentioned, I think, really just carries that legacy of trying to create a purer Reformation within England.
Yeah, and by God's providence that those things happen. I think sometimes we think that politics resides outside the sovereign control of God, and that politics is just the inventions and the activities of men. politics are the activities of men, but they are still under the sovereign control of God. And here's why I'm saying that as it relates to confessionalism. That is the very seedbed upon which the First London was written. Historically, what was going on in 1643, Parliament had commissioned the Westminster Divines to begin to put together a confession of faith that would unify the Church of England and to purify some of the aspects of worship there that had kind of gotten out of bounds. And so in 1643, you have the beginnings of what today is now the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is the confession of faith for our Presbyterian brothers. Well, in and about that time, in 1644, because of the political pressure that was being generated by the Westminster Divines and the formation of this confession, there were people coming to England from other places under the Anabaptist heading who had created some division and dissension and rebellion in other parts of Europe, and they were moving into England. And the English government began to be concerned about rebellion and sedition within English ranks. And so the First London Confession in 1644 was to differentiate our particular Baptist forefathers from the Anabaptist anarchists that were coming from other parts of Europe.
Right, and just to kind of clarify this, the Anabaptists and Baptists don't share the same genealogy, essentially.
Correct.
The Anabaptists were part of the radical reformers of the 16th century that participated at times in some pretty sketchy things, most notably the Munster Rebellion of 1534. And that historically, that's still on the mind of, for example, the framers of Westminster and those political forces that are adopting that confession, and it became important around that same time for Baptists to articulate. No, wait a minute, we're Baptists, not Anabaptists.
Yes.
We're not those seditious rebels that you're so afraid of.
Well, and they took on the term particular Baptist, and that's how it's usually referenced, at least in historical writings, as the particular Baptist. English particular Baptist as opposed to the Anabaptist. But I'm going to set Anabaptist to the side for a second because we're focusing on our Baptist heritage, our particular Baptist heritage. And so what happened in 1644, 7 churches in England that were particular Baptist churches, not Anabaptist, but particular Baptist. So what we mean is they were Calvinistic, they were Reformed in their thinking. Issued a document to the Westminster Divines to say, hey, we are different than the Anabaptist or the seditionists that have come across from Munster and doing some things that are unsavory. We are not them. And they really wanted to demonstrate clearly that they were of the Reformed tradition and that they believed in the doctrinal tenets that the Westminster Divines were at that time formulating. And so, again, the confession, the First London, was formed in the crucible of pain of death because, right. England was working to remove sedition from its ranks. And so being lumped in with a group of seditionists could have meant, an early demise. And so, not only were our Baptist forefathers desirous to escape that, obviously, they wanted to make sure that they were seen as being orthodox in their doctrines. And so,
right.
So 1644, we have 7 churches in London, in England, that issue what is known as the First London Confession. And the fascinating thing about that is that none of those guys, none of the pastors of those churches, those first 7 churches, had formal education. They were just pastors. They were just guys in the church leading congregations, preaching the Word of God.
I can relate to the no formal education there.
Well, yeah, because when God calls you, God calls you.
That's right.
Yeah. So, and they were dealing and writing and conversing with, and at certain points, they were having disputations with the cream of the crop within the Westminster Divines.
Right.
I mean, there were some very big heavy hitters in there theologically that they were writing to, answering questions, refuting, objections and those sorts of things. And so that period of the early 1640s, we begin to see the formation of these historical confessions. And I just want to add as a footnote, a lot of times the London Baptist Confession, because it was officially published and formalized in 1689, is seen as the Johnny-come-lately of the historic Reformed confessions, when in fact the first London, which is the predecessor, the granddaddy of the 1689, was actually being formed in and about the same time as the Westminster was. And I think Westminster actually holds a lot of its richness and robustness. It holds that because it was dealing with particular Baptist in London. It was answering questions. It was taking the objections, and it was actually interacting with Reformed Baptists, right, or particular Baptists in that point in time. So they fed off each other, and they really helped each other. I think that was a great growth experience for both groups to interact with each other.
So then in that case, we could say that Presbyterians and Reformed Baptists have been cooperating in some sense from the very beginning.
We have. Yeah, absolutely we have. And, and we've been holding each other accountable from the very beginning. And, we've been, well, if you say this, I say that. There's a little bit of that dialogue that goes on, which is, and I think is great between Reformed Baptist and mainline Presbyterians, conservative Orthodox Presbyterians, to have this conversation that is as old as, the early 1600s.
Right.
And so it helps us both grow.
Yeah, I like that. Can you talk just a little bit about now the Second London Baptist Confession, and it's being sort of the logical next step in this interaction with Westminster? Because if you look at the 1689, which actually written in 1677, as you look at that, you begin to see the real parallel of thought between the two confessions.
Yeah. And I want to add one more in there, and that is the Savoy, which is the confession for Congregationalists. That's the Jonathan Edwards camp here in America. You fast forward from 1644, 46, that area, to 1658, and you have the Savoy Declaration of Faith, which was Congregationalist. Now, in this discussion of the three confessions, the Westminster, the Savoy, and the 1689, Westminster is Presbyterian, so it's going to have a church polity with a session or a presbyter above the local church. So they're going to have a hierarchical church government outside the local church. And Westminster is paedo-baptistic. Okay, so they're going to be infant baptism. The Congregationalist church was an autonomy of the local church, but paedo-baptism or infant baptism. And then you have the Baptists, which were autonomy of the local church, no church government above the local church. And we're what's called Credo Baptist, which is confessional Baptist. We make a profession and we baptize after that. So, I know that's a discussion for another day, but we need to make sure that we understand who the players were.
Right. And I failed to mention Savoy. That's a great point. The significance of that document to the development of the Second London Confession of Faith.
And that's why I mentioned it, because you have the First London interacting with Westminster in the early days, but the first London, in part because of the men who wrote it, in part because of the situation under which they wrote it. I don't want to say they wrote it under duress, but they weren't just having a theological Bible conference and they were presenting their position paper. It was a serious deal. They were in danger of arrest and being killed as seditionists. So they're getting to some points pretty quickly, and the First London, and I think everybody would agree, is not as finely nuanced as the Second London is. Yeah. And so you got the Westminster that is actually formalized and published in 1646. And then the Congregationalists are building upon the work that the First London and Westminster is doing. They come up with the Savoy in 1658. And then you have the Second London that takes from the Westminster, answers questions, makes distinctions based upon the Westminster, and it also interacts with the Savoy. and at some points is much more closer in line with the Savoy than it is the Westminster. At other points, not so much.
Right.
But building upon the Savoy, Westminster and the Savoy, as well as all of the other preceding documents that we mentioned early on that were the foundational confessions. Then the Second London, which was actually written and formalized in 1677, was not actually published in the open public air until the Articles of Toleration in the early 1660s. And so in 1689, the churches of England come together, the particular Baptist churches of England come together and in conference adopt the 1689 as the confessional standard for particular Baptist of the day. And so that's kind of a brief history of how we got there.
That is a brief history. For anyone that's interested in this topic and wants to dig more into the history of all of this, two great resources that come to mind, two great men to listen to or to read on this. For me, the two best are Sam Waldron and also Jim Renahan.
Yes.
Anything you can get by those guys, they both have expositions of the confession, and those guys are great resources.
Yeah, Jim wrote an excellent book on the First London called Vindication of the Truth, which is a historical recounting of the First London Confession. Then also Rob Ventura has got an excellent work on the Second London Confession, which we're naming resources here. Those have been two that have been very helpful for me.
Good deal. Well, just a quick note: neither one of those guys have any idea who I am, and they have no idea that we're referencing their stuff on this show. So we're not hawking anybody's material.
No.
These are just resources that have been beneficial to us.
That's right.
Well, Rusty, look, let's do this. For most of our listening audience, they're going to be coming out of sort of a Southern Baptist background and a Southern Baptist context. And most Southern Baptists really don't think of themselves as confessional.
Right.
But let's kind of just take a couple of minutes here and get into this idea of confessionalism and its importance to the Southern Baptist Convention.
Okay.
Most notably, with reference to the Abstract of Principles, which is one of the founding documents of Southern Seminary, as well as the Baptist Faith and Message. And maybe we could just draw some parallels and distinctions between these primary confessions of the SBC to what I would say is the ultimate confession of faith in the 1689.
Yeah. Well, to kind of understand that, I think we need to have a little bit of a biographical sketch or historical sketch of those confessions. As you've got 1689 Second London Confession in England. Obviously, in history, we know that the colonies were up and running. And that America was an English colony, and then the Revolutionary War and all that. So we actually have in what's called the Philadelphia Confession of Faith. That's 1742. So that confession actually predates our own Constitution as American.
That's
here.
an important point.
Yeah, the Philadelphia has kind of been unofficially called the American 1689. They basically took the 1689 and brought it to America. They added a couple articles to it, laying on of hands and the singing of hymns and worship. But other than that, the Philadelphia is pretty much the 1689. But in that day and time, there was this movement to have things American as opposed to have things English, and so the Philadelphia came across that way.
We were not in a very warm and cozy mood with England.
No,
at the
we
time,
weren't.
Right?
We weren't, and so but we did take the best of English theologians and brought it to America.
Now that's the truth. Absolutely.
And so we see the Philadelphia in 1742. And then from there, we come to what's called the New Hampshire Confession of Faith of 1833. And we'll talk in just a minute about the differences in those. But this was just a simple progression of confessionalism in America. And the point I want to make is that confessionalism has been part and parcel of Baptist thought from the very beginning.
Yes.
Now, we've migrated away from it in our modern expressions of Baptist thought these days, but historically, confessions, and in particular, the 1689 as embodied in the Philadelphia, have been part of Baptist thought and Baptist practice from the earliest days of Baptist in America. And so that is carried over to the New Hampshire of 1833. It is amazing to me, Adam, that as I go and visit churches, especially smaller kind of rural churches, they will have the New Hampshire Confession of Faith posted, framed and posted in their front foyer of their church.
Yeah.
And it was the founding confession of many of the churches that are still practicing today, still alive, still working and preaching the gospel today. And so it was an important part of our Baptist heritage. And then we get into, starting in about 1925, the Baptist Faith and Message, and a lot of modern day Southern Baptists are familiar with at least the term Baptist Faith and Message. And so it had three renditions, 1925, 1963, which Herschel Hobbs was instrumental in 63, and then 2000, the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message, which I believe is what they're still operating under, with some amendments today.
Maybe at this point it would be good to talk a little bit about just maybe a comparison between churches that do affirm the Baptist Faith and Message and churches that want to go a step farther and say, hey, while we may not disagree with the Baptist Faith and Message, what is it about the 1689 that makes it what we would say an even more helpful resource to our confessional standard today?
Well, each time that there was a new confession or a new edition of, say, the Baptist Faith and Message, they were responding to cultural issues. Women in ministry or women being pastors over churches is still today a fairly large discussion within Southern Baptist circles. Gender roles is another one. What is it? Personhood is another one. And those play out into all kinds of social issues that, are alive and well today. And so what we see at each rendition of the confessions is a softening of language that tends to be offensive to some people, in lieu of language that is a little more amenable or a little more accommodating. And on the surface, that may not seem like a bad thing. We want to be at peace with all people as much as it depends upon us. The Apostle Paul teaches us that. But at the same time, in using softer language, we lose a bit of the precision of the preceding confession, and it opens the door for a lot of ambiguity and questions. And then when people really find out what's being said, then real offense and real hurt in light of, well, why didn't you just tell me that from the beginning?
Right. Yeah.
And so we see that, the Philadelphia was the 1689 just Americanized, and the New Hampshire of 1833 took the Philadelphia and it softened some of the Calvinistic language, some of the election predestination language in the Philadelphia and the 1689, and attempted to make it a little more palatable to an American audience. And then the Baptist Faith and Message in 23 did the same thing. It began to clarify certain issues, use a little more modern language, use a little more softer terms. And then we find that pattern in the Baptist Faith and Message from 23 to, from 25 to 63, and then to 2000.
Right.
And my I would just say this, my criticism of that, and this is why we're a 1689 church, is I think in this world where words have multiple meanings and people will say one thing and use a sleight of the eye to indicate what their true meaning is, but then renounce that meaning when somebody, calls them on it. I'm more along the line. Let's just say what we say. Let's say what we mean and mean what we say. And we're not here to offend anybody, but we don't want ambiguity. We don't want suspicion and distrust. We just want to be open, straightforward. This is what we believe. And if people find that offensive, it greatly grieves us when they find things offensive. We try to,
particularly something that is so patently biblical, something that is
absolutely
rooted in Scripture so much, right?
Yeah, not just not one text, but multiple texts throughout Old and New Testament, both.
Well, as we talk about this, I think it's going to be important for us to articulate this clearly. The Baptist Faith and Message is not a bad document, but it is an intentionally broad document.
Yeah.
It's a document that was written in such a way to avoid the specificity that you've pointed to within the 1689 that really puts a fine point on some doctrines that some people are a little bit nervous holding to. And that sort of brings up the question. There are some objections by very well-meaning brothers to our 1689 Confession of Faith.
There is.
One of which would be the overtly Calvinistic perspective of the opening 9 chapters.
Right. Yeah, and to this point, since the confession is built on the Scriptures, and we're reading the Scriptures and seeing election. Well, I'm just going to put it under a broader heading. This is election, predestination, those issues. We typically refer to that as God's sovereign grace.
Right.
So we're sovereign grace people, that God sovereignly chooses whom he grants salvation to. And of course, even in the expression of that opens up all kinds of questions and people kind of, getting their air up a little bit. But anyhow, we believe that God has sovereignly elected the church, those unto salvation, and that either directly or indirectly, he has sovereignly elected everyone that's not elected into salvation and elected them into what we call reprobation or lostness. Okay,
right. Which is the natural state of man.
That is the natural state of man. That is correct. And so the point is that because that doctrine, which was originally given to the church as an encouragement, you were saved because God has saved you, not because you recited a prayer or walked an aisle or whatever, that God has chosen you from before the foundation of the world to bring you to salvation, was intended to be an encouragement to the church. Our enemy, Satan, has taken what was meant to be an encouragement and turned it into something that divides the church.
Right.
And so, at any rate, we deal with that by saying, look, this is what the Bible teaches, and we'll be willing to walk through every text in the Bible one by one,
right,
to illustrate that.
And many of those are footnoted in our Confession of Faith. So
yes,
it makes
they are.
It really easy to look those up.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, there's that objection. There's also objections, for example, the Sabbatarian position of the 1689. I think that really depends on an understanding of the Fourth Commandment as having moral value for us even today. And some churches that are in more of an antinomian mindset would reject the idea of Sabbath observance for Christians. There's also we're kind of looking at things warts and all here. There's the language regarding the Antichrist, which again would require a whole separate episode to get into that fully.
Yeah.
But our confession articulates, because of the historical context, the Pope as that Antichrist, meaning that one who is opposed to the gospel as laid out in Scripture. So it is a bold document for sure.
It is.
And we appreciate that, and we appreciate that clarity. Well, if you could, I'm getting the signal here to wrap things up for this episode. Rusty, just leave us with 30 seconds of just a final statement on why we love the 1689 and what it has, the benefits that it's offered to our congregations.
Clarity. If I could sum it up in one word, I'd say clarity. There is, as you read the 1689 at its various points, it is extremely clear. That's what a confession of faith is. A confession of faith is a statement with clarity and precision as to the beliefs of a particular group of people, as opposed to a statement of faith, which is just a briefer statement, not as clear, not as long. It's just a quick snapshot.
And often not as precise.
Yeah. That's right.
Well, that's good stuff. Well, Rusty, thank you for being here today again and for participating in this radio show. Thank you for contributing to these last 2 episodes, actually. Thank you to everyone who's listening today. Thank you for being with us to hear the program. If you have any questions or comments for the show, feel free to email us at veritasrbc@gmail.com. That's V as in Victor, ERITSRBC@gmail.com. Join us next week on KMLB News Talk 540 AM and 105.7 FM for another episode of For the Love of Truth. Until then, may we continue to walk in the light of truth, because ultimately all truth is God's truth.